Welcome back to the Penny Family History Slideshow, Part 5. Welcome again. My name is David Penny. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the family and their immigration from Scotland, from Aberdeenshire to Canada. Now, that immigration goes in several small waves. And in this episode, we'll deal with the first one and a very, very interesting episode, which is the initial immigration of Annie. So let's get right into it. But as always, before we start, a little toast to the Penny family history and the successful execution of the Penny family history slideshow. Cheers. Maybe though, before we get into it, just a quick bit of review. So as you'll recall, the Robert Kelman Penny in Aberdeenshire marries Jane Clark, and they have several children, one of which is John Clark Penny, Sr. John Clark Penny is the head of the family that comes over to Canada. He's married to Anne Gavin Ross. Her mom and dad are Anne McKay and Alexander Ross. John and Anne have several children. The oldest is James Penny, and James gets through the war. Next one is Jack, or John Clark Penny Jr., and Jack unfortunately perishes in the war. The third son is Alex, and Alex makes it all the way through the war. And then there's the daughter Annie, and then there's the youngest son, Alan. And Alan is my grandfather, so Alan is the father of Douglas Penny, who's my dad, and Wayne Penny. Today's episode, so basically all of this family, from here on down, they're all in Canada. They all come to Canada. And the first one to come is Annie, and that's followed by Jim and Alex, who traveled together. And then that's followed by John and Anne and Alan and Mal, who follow soon after that. So today's episode, though, we're going to focus on Annie. And this episode actually has some new information, since if you've been watching up to now, you know I had a lot of question marks around Annie. The family had a lot of question marks. But in preparation for this episode, I was doing some research, and I made some real breakthroughs about Anne. I discovered who the mysterious Bob was. Bob was Robert Nathaniel Snedden, actually. So I'll get into all of that story in this episode. So as of 1918, the family was living in Inverurie, but they're all gone by 1923, leaving only the granddad, Robert Kelman Penny, who dies soon after in 1924 in the city of Aberdeen. So Inverurie is over here. You can see just a little bit outside of Aberdeen. I have some photos of Inverurie in a moment. So I mainly get this information. You get it from censuses generally. But there was no census, I guess, in 1921 that I could see. But we have voter rolls from that time. Now, one of the key things about voter rolls is that you won't see anyone who's not eligible to vote. So you won't see my granddad, who was too young. So Alan was born only in 1905. So in 1918, he's only, what does that make him? 13 years old. And unfortunately, you won't see Annie either, even though she was, I think, 19, 20 at this time. Women had only acquired the vote in 1918 for the 1918 vote. And even then, while men were allowed to vote from 18 on, women weren't allowed to vote until they were 30 years old. So being under 30, she would not have been listed here either. So that's why you won't see those two names there. But what we do see in 1918 is we see, first of all, Robert Kelman Penny and his wife, Mrs. Jane Clark Penny, and they're living at 1 Presley Place in Inverurie. And then we see the rest of the family on 82A Harla Road. So this is John Clark Penny. He's listed as a hammerman. So I actually saw in a different entry, there was the job of mason, a stonemason, and then in brackets there was hammerman. So I think I've confirmed that hammerman is at least a sub-branch of being a mason. Perhaps they were the guys who split open the rocks and others laid them. But he was listed as a stonemason, basically. And then there was his wife, Mrs. Ann Gavin Penny, in the same address. Jim lived with them as well, and he was a postman in Inverurie, and he lived there as well. And then Alex was still a soldier in 1918. He wasn't fully discharged until 1919, but he also lived in Harla Road as well. So that was as it stood as of 1918. And then by 1923, we see only these three pennies listed. And some of these pennies, I don't believe they're related at all, the ones that I've crossed out here. Two of those still remain, and the only penny from our family that I know of that's left is Robert Kelman Penny. So it means his wife as well passed on. I believe she passed on in 1919, because we also have 1920 voter rolls. So Robert K. was left behind and dies soon after this. Here's some photos around that time of Inverurie. That this is clearly after World War I, because this here is the World War I memorial that I showed you in the previous episode with the name of Jack on it. And just here's some other scenes around what Inverurie looked like at the time. So we'll be dealing with Annie in this episode. Annie leaves first. So this is Annie's birth certificate that we have in our family records. You can see that she was born in 1898 on October the 15th, I believe that says, at the Mains of Naperna in Udny, Ellon, Aberdeenshire, to John Clark Penny, at the time was a cattleman, and Ann Gavin Penny, maiden name of Ross. So there's no doubt as to when Annie was born. So Annie has a son, a guy we know as Uncle Mal. This is Annie, and this is Mal. Malcolm Sidney Penny. And we don't know where the middle name Sidney came from. It was born to Annie on January 19th, 1920. The father is unknown. You can see this is a copy of the birth certificate that was issued in 1953. I guess Uncle Mel needed it for some reason. But they apparently they go in and they copy onto this all the relevant information that was there. And you can see that she lived in January 19th, 1920 on 82A Harla Road with the rest of the family, even though she wasn't listed. She was too young to vote as a female. And there's only a mother listed, and she's listed as being a factory worker, and there's no father listed at all. And it's signed. So the father is believed to have been a soldier from Canada who was fighting overseas and was discharged, and I guess was waiting around, similar to where Alex was still in the army, but pending the final discharge, which was more like 1919. So sometime 9 months before January 19th, 1920, so early in 1919, Annie got pregnant with, the family lore has it, a soldier from Winnipeg, or the Winnipeg area in Manitoba in Canada. Annie arranges to go to Winnipeg, to go to Manitoba. I get it's maybe to track down the husband, to go find him. Maybe she maintained a relationship with him after he left, or not. We're not exactly sure of that. But she arranges to go work at the Metropolitan Hotel in Melita in the Souris region of Manitoba. Souris is both a town and a region around Souris. There's actually the Souris River that connects Melita to the town of Souris, and the region at that time was called Souris in Manitoba. So she leaves Mal with Jock and Ann in September of 1920 and goes to Manitoba. I guess they all had plans that they were all going to meet up in Canada, and so it was easier to travel without the baby, I suppose. But we can see this is the list of people who are on the ship, and you can see Annie Penny. Her entry is down here on this line, and I've taken that line and I've split it in two and brought it up here. Annie Penny, they've got her age wrong. It's 24. She was actually 22 at the time, and that's corrected on a different form. But she's headed off to Melita, Manitoba. She's not a man. This column says she's female. Melita, Manitoba, to work as a waitress at the Metropolitan Hotel. And that's a picture of Annie from Toronto, actually, but she would have looked very similar to that at the time. So she goes across on a very oddly, coincidentally named ship called the Melita. So that threw me for a loop. She's going to Melita, and she's on the ship called the Melita. And I doubled and triple checked that, and it's absolutely true. It must have given everybody a bit of a giggle at the time. Anyways, strange coincidence. Here you see the SS Melita. This is her passenger declaration form for immigration purposes, the so-called Form 30A, and all of the family has a Form 30A. 1920, September 17th, 1920. Her occupation is listed as waitress. Her age here is again wrong. I think they took it from the same location, but as I say, in other places it's correct. Her birthplace is wrong as well. It's listed as Buchan, which is up more north and east in Aberdeenshire. And she wasn't born in Buchan. She was born in Udny, near Udny Station. So I'm not sure, maybe with both the age and the name, if it wasn't just a transcription error, they just got the wrong line and copied it down wrong onto this. But there's other elements that kind of proves she's Annie. She's headed to Melita over here. But the dead giveaway here is the nearest relative in country from where the passenger came. And I've copied that down here. The nearest relative is father, Mr. Penny, 82 Harla Road, Inverurie. So I think that can only possibly be Annie based on that piece of information. Annie gets to Melita, and she starts working as a waitress in the Metropolitan Hotel. And so the Melita arrives September 24th in Quebec City. So I don't know what that means. Sometime in October, I guess, she has to board the train and get all the way from Quebec over to Melita, Manitoba. But so she must arrive mid-October, perhaps. But on December 18, already there's a marriage record for her. And this is the record. It's pulled up from the Manitoba online marriage register. See, the place of marriage was Melita on December 18th, 1920. Anne McKay Penny, clearly. And I think this is a bit garbled, but Nathanael Robert Snedden. So we actually believe his name is Robert Nathaniel Snedon with an O. And this got a little bit garbled. And that's a picture of, looks like that could have been taken, at the time of the wedding, perhaps. But that's Annie, and that's Bob. So in our family records, in my dad's book, this guy is identified simply as Bob. And they say they don't know anything about Bob. So I think we've solved the mystery of who Bob was. Anyways, and there's more corroborating evidence that I'll get to. But so it's very peculiar, of course, that she immediately got married. It's also quite peculiar that this is so close to Souris, which is, as you'll recall, where Jim worked on a farm when he visited Canada earlier. So perhaps Bob was a friend of Jim's. Perhaps Bob was the husband, was rather the actual father of Mal, and she went to. But we were told that she married someone who was definitely not the father, but who knows? So this is from the 1921 census of Canada. This is from Manitoba province, the Souris region, the subdistrict called Melita. And they did a census that year, and this is everybody who lived in the same location. And I'm not 100% sure, but I believe this was likely the Metropolitan Hotel. And Annie Snedden is listed here. Now, this is taken as of June 1st, 1921, so they were already married for 6 months or so. Although she doesn't live with him, she continues her waitressing job living at the hotel. And you can see the name, Annie Snedden, I think correctly with the O-N. Age is correctly given as 22. The date that implies the birth year. The year of immigration is listed on the extract. The scan of this thing is 1910. But if you actually look at it, over here it is. And if you look at that in detail, it actually does say 1920. So this was some kind of a transcription error to pull out the searchable information from this. So they did get the 1920 correct. It wasn't really 1910. Melita, she's a waiter in a hotel. That's her income, $270 a year, perhaps. And these are the fellow household members. You can see there's an older fella who's listed as a servant. There's a mother and a bunch of daughters, and a head of the household, Isabella Briggs. It's all very strange. And then a bunch of probably hotel workers, including Annie Snedden there as well. So she was working in Melita, definitely. So where is Melita? So here's a map of near Winnipeg. This is Lake Winnipeg over here. Melita is down here, and Souris over there, around which we're told in this region, where Jim was on a farm the first time when he went to Canada earlier. And Melita and Souris are connected by the Souris River. So not very far apart or far from Winnipeg. Now, there is a Robert Nathaniel Snedden, I found, who's a farmer from Fisher Branch up here, born in 1889, so he would be only 9 years older than Annie. In other words, at this time, 31 years old. Annie's 22 in 1920. That Robert Nathaniel Snedden joined up in the Canadian Expeditionary Force to go overseas to fight in World War I. So he joined May 30th, 1917. Sorry, I should say 17. And he was discharged on December 12th. The discharge states he was medically unfit, might have gotten ill or had an accident. And it says the discharge took place in Winnipeg. But I don't know if that's where the paperwork was done or where he physically was located. And between May and December, it's hardly enough time to get trained, go overseas, get into a battle, get injured, and be discharged. So I'm not sure he ever left the Winnipeg area or not. So, and if he did go, he'd have to stay all the way up to March 1919 to knock up Annie. I don't know, maybe that's possible if you get discharged over there in 1917. There's a big war going on. It's very dangerous to go across the ocean. The Lusitania was sunk, for instance, by the Germans. So maybe you just hung out there until after the war. But this Robert Nathaniel Snedden, that one had a wife called Nellie and a child listed on the military forms of 1917. So he would have had to have, maybe they died before 1920, or he divorced them, or he was a bigamist and he married Annie as well, or maybe it's a different Robert Nathaniel Snedden, because she definitely married a Nathaniel Robert Snedden, And we'll see later on in her death certificate that it's listed Robert N. Snedden as her husband, and that death certificate has other corroborating evidence. So we don't know for sure, and it's very mysterious one way or the other. But we do have pictures of Bob. Bob and Annie come back to Toronto because that's where Jock and the family left, and they brought Mal there. And I don't think Annie was abandoning Mal. You can see there's photos of Annie with Mal. She seems to be quite fond of the little tyke. But anyways, they come back to Toronto. This is Bob, Jock, and Annie in 1922. They're already back in Toronto. That's taken on Scarborough Beach. And here they are in the parks. This is Anne and Jock. That's little Mal in Jock's lap. And that's Annie there, and that's Bob there. So they're all friendly. They're all getting along. They're all going on outings together. They actually lived in an apartment on John Street. So they lived separately from Jock and Ann. And we don't know if Mal was with them or with them living. There was no census at the time to tell us. Here's Uncle Alec posing with Bob. Bob has a pretty distinctive kind of flat, looks like a punched-in nose, looks like he was a boxer maybe. And there's an old photo of Jock, Mal, and Anne around 1922 as well. And there again is Jock and Ann and Uncle Mal. And here's Annie with Mal in her lap. Not sure who that is in the background. And this one here is a photo of, this is Annie here. This is Alec here, Mal here, and there's Bob. We're not sure who he is. He looks an awful lot like a Penny with the penny ears, but he looks like Alan Penny, but is not. Alan is quite a bit younger than that, and he's clearly not Jock. And there's Alec, and Jim doesn't look like that at all. So we don't know who this fella is over here. And this photo looks to be taken in Toronto on Keewatin Street. And this is, again, Mal. He's a bit older here. We think it's around 1922, maybe 1923. And that's Bob. And we don't know who this is, but there's a little notation that my dad made, and maybe he was guessing that that's perhaps Bob's father. But I don't think that my dad would have guessed at that. He would have heard that from probably Alan or Phyllis, probably Alan, who maybe guessed that that was Bob's father. So it was a more informed guess because it came from Alan. You can see he's got his hand kind of possessively on Malcolm as if he was like a granddad. Again, that's taken on Keewatin Street in Toronto. Unfortunately, Annie dies. She passes May 5th, 1923. So because I figured out the name of Bob Snedden, I was able to now find the death certificate for Annie, and I'm reproducing it here. So it's Annie Snedden, as you can see here. It's in the county of York, in the division of Toronto. Her birthplace is Scotland. The name of the father is John Penny from Scotland, which is correct. This seems to be a bit garbled. The maiden name of mother, Annie McKay. So that maybe seems a bit garbled. Annie McKay was actually Anne Gavin Ross's mom, was named Annie McKay. And Anne, of course, was Anne. So, and Annie McKay was the name of Annie. So there may have been a bit of confusion there. The name of the informant is Robert N. Snedden, and his relation is husband. And you can see he lived on John Street, 134, I believe. 137 John Street, perhaps. You can see the name of the deceased, Annie Snedden, on May 5th, 1923. Now, May 5th, 1923 corresponds with the date in my dad's family chronology. So again, highly, highly likely this is Annie. What did she die of? A miscarriage, septic, so blood poisoning after a miscarriage. She was in the hospital for 5 days. Septicemia was a contributor. So she had a miscarriage, I guess, and no antibiotics that were any good at the time. So rest in peace, Annie. Passed at age, she was 24 years old, I guess, when she died. There's some pictures of her the year she died. So I guess there must have been a discussion as Bob was there about what were they going to do with Mal, and of course Mal, I guess, was very familiar with Jock and Ann, and if it's true that Mal was not the son of the natural son of Bob, then I don't find it that unusual that they decided to leave Mal with Jock and Ann, and effectively a younger brother to Alec and Alan. And that's what they did. And so we don't know what happened to Bob after that point. There's a few years later. There's Jock, Mal, and Anne. And here's kind of the whole family. Anne there, and that's Alan here, Alec here, Jock here, and Mal over there, all in 1927. That was the family that lived together. So I guess we'll leave it there for this episode. A nice little compact episode entirely about Annie and the mystery surrounding Annie. So here, let's raise a glass to Uncle Mal's mom, Annie, and she looked like a fun and pretty remarkable woman, and so sad that she perished when she did. Here's to Annie.